her career in modern society demands she place herself in a subordinate position or even renounce normal life. The social dice are loaded against her, and the plain fact of the matter is that they're loaded not only in the economic opportunities, but in the minds of men. The men cannot take it. I know my own sex reasonably well. With the best will in the world, a man, a good man, unconsciously demands that a woman submit to him. It is what he wants that matters in the end, not what she wants. Some men are cruelly egotistic, some others are not. They believe in equality, but the practice of society dominates them. It must, as long as they do not consciously oppose it. End quote. So James's candid assessment of patriarchy refutes any suggestion that the woman question, as it was then called in Marxist circles, could be resolved by a vulgarly materialist approach, but simultaneously focuses on the middle-class career woman as the locus of his concerns. An explanation of this focus is seen in his 1950 text, American Civilization, not published until 1993 under the editorship of someone who is in his room at the moment, in which James suggests that his decision to focus on this group is due to the intermediate position that they hold within society, through which all of the ambivalences of women's new freedoms are supposedly most fully crystallized. So this is the reason why James says, I'm going to focus on the middle-class career women. These women, who are the chief beneficiaries of the capitalist system, are, and I quote, the most unhappy, the most dissatisfied, the most antagonistic in their relations with men that it is possible to find in history, or as far as can be gathered, in other parts of the world. End quote. Though the argument has been won over the right of these women to have a career, the antagonism between theoretical and practical life continues. While James yields at points in his analysis to the temptations that are highly important but narrow economic determinism might give him, when he says things, for example, like, it is equally obvious that so drastic an overturn in contemporary domestic relations is conditioned upon an equally drastic overturn in economic relations, he later would suggest, and I quote again, in the modern world, the only possible solution of the basic relation between the sexes is that women must become human beings first and women afterwards, end quote. Even when the most cursory freedoms seem to have been granted to women via their ability to work outside the home, they bear the weight of the majority of the housework. Even more oppressive than this is that, and I quote James again, except in rare cases, the responsibility for adjustments to differences of personality falls almost automatically upon her. The women's movement is part of a larger struggle for humanity in the present age, as, James again, today, equality is not an individual need or the subjective passion of a few intense or rebellious people. From every point of view, it is a social necessity in the modern world. Now, this focus on middle-class women is necessary for James so he can show, from his perspective, the distinctive gender nature of women's oppression in American capitalist society. Working-class women are therefore given only a cursory treatment, which notes the modern nature of their lives, points out that the same hardships that afflict middle-class women afflict them with tenfold force. In a very strange formulation, James adds that working-class women, and keep in mind this is from one of the major Marxist theoreticians in mid-20th century America. This is what he's saying about working-class women. I quote, are less vocal, they protest less. History has repeatedly shown that this is not because they feel less, but because they can see no way out. End quote. There is similarly an absence of any discussion of race or racialized oppression, leading one to conclude that James's middle-class woman is very likely white. So it's quite extraordinary in the presence of figures in mid-20th century America, like the great Trinidadian radical, Claudia Jones, that James ends up, this is his first real non-fiction stab at writing about women. He ends up using the middle-class white woman as his example of the nature of oppression of women in American society. And of course it's difficult to go too far in terms of this particular critique of James, because American Civilization was supposedly a provisional document that James hoped to further revise after he left America. And James leaves America in 1953. This was drafted in 1950. Keith Hart and Anna Grimshaw published it in 1993. But there is no full sense that James really worked on the manuscript after he left America. Okay? And Grimshaw and Hart note that parts of James's analysis of American women, which were intended for the revised version of American civilization, were later going to be incorporated into Facing Reality, which was his evaluation of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. However, the interesting thing about Facing Reality is that the position that James has on gender and on women is very different in Facing Reality than in American civilization. And we see certainly a fundamental shift taking place here in James. Here we have a very strong critique of women's relation to capitalist society. He talks about how the central paradox of women's life is that purported equality before the law has only further exposed the restrictions placed upon them due to their gendered identities in class society. He repudiates what he calls, and I quote, the shams and vulgarity and cruelty of bourgeois mentality. And he then states, it is in the United States, where women are abstractly the most free, that there is taking place a colossal struggle for the establishment of truly human relations between men and women, end quote. However, and this is in a complete reversal of the argument he's making in American civilization. He states that the real battle for new relations between the sexes is being fought above all in the American working class, okay? Not in the middle class whatsoever. And the tensions in middle class heterosexual relations merely signal the problem of which the middle class is very loath to deal with. It can only resort to the dissolution of these unions or greater antagonism in sex and personal relations. The working class for this 1958 James alone have the potential to transform these relationships into something new and hence enable women to, quote unquote, live a complete life. Continuing this line of argument then, 2 years later, in a series of lectures in Trinidad titled Modern Politics in 1960, James will note the following. For many centuries, women were the most oppressed section of society, and it is common knowledge, common talk, writing among philosophers, that society was usually to be judged by the position that women occupied in it. Further to this, James suggests that the beginning of a truly satisfactory relationship in personal lives must begin with a total reorganization of labor relations in every department of life. The solution to the perennial problem then of gender injustice, which colonizes both the public and private spaces that women inhabit, is a reorganization for James of labor in both the public and private spheres. So all of this James is saying, and these are his thoughts in the 1950s up to 1960 on the question of gender and women's liberation. Now, what causes this particular shift in James? Now, there are a few things to be very clear about. James is writing on gender in American civilization before he meets his second wife, Selma James. Okay? However, he meets her in New York in 1950, and Selma James, in her address at the CLR James Centenary Conference, was very, very clear on this. I mean, she actually made it very clear that James was writing on gender before he met her. But then, when he met her, and I mean, at this time, she was 23, he was 53, he was absolutely astonished at the insights she was giving him. And he suggested to her, you've got to write them down, this is how you do it. And from there, they were both part of a Marxist tendency, Johnson Forrest tendency. It became her well-known pamphlet, A Woman's Place, okay, which was published in the early 1950s. So James was writing on gender before he met Selma James, but at the same time, there's clearly an influence that's not quite been established between the two of them after this fact. And Selma James, of course, is the head of the International Wages for Housewives campaign and a very profound radical. And in James's later years, she debated him endlessly, particularly in their very acrimonious divorce in the early 1980s, about the value of unwaged work that she actually provided to him over those years. Okay? Yet, despite this, one of the interesting things is that the record from the 1960s also does not show a clear, straightforward progression in James's thought on gender and woman. Because he gives a talk in Montreal in 1967 called The Man-Woman Relation, which is one of the most bewildering and strange talks that James ever probably gave. It's a whole set of labored attempts to understand the oppression woman, and is filled with all of these idiosyncratic juxtapositions of Shakespeare and Russia and the woman question, and it shows really, critically enough, it has very little of a sympathy that we see in the text from the 1940s into the 1950s. And similarly, in his unpublished autobiography, he has a chapter called The Climax of My Political Ideas. And in the climax of My Political Ideas, the question of gender is nowhere evident. And the draft that I've read of the climax of My Political Ideas dates from about the mid-1970s. So again, we can see an oscillation back and forth on these kinds of questions by James. Okay? However, the most important and the most interesting moment, I would suggest, for understanding James and gender is going to come in the late 70s into the early 80s. And it's going to come as a result of the encounter that he has with African American women writers. And that's where I'd like to get us to in a moment. Oh, I didn't need to go away. Okay, in a sec. In a number of his interviews in the 1970s, James makes a number of striking comments about the newly emerging work of Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, and Ntozake Shange. Okay? And he was very struck by these writers. And he says that one of the reasons why he was so captivated by them is that they're speaking about black women as they exist in the world. They're announcing the birth of a new social movement. They don't find that they have to reproduce the politics of a white women's movement, or alternatively, simply give another perspective on the black aesthetic. They're introducing something new. And at one point in the interview in the late 1970s, he's asked about whether he had written about black women in his prior work. And this is what James says. Not particularly, but I've written about black people in general. I've written about black people and I've taken society as a whole. But I've been struck that ever since I came here, and this is James's return to America in 1969 to do lectures and to also teach at Federal City College in Washington. I've been struck that ever since I came here in America in 1969. It is the first time that the entry of a black woman into political and social activity has hit me as never before in my life. Before, they were just part of a general struggle, and I saw them in Trinidad taking part in doing good work, but the way they've come to the front is exciting, and nothing is going to take place without them. So James's candor is remarkable, though very disconcerting in some ways, as one can only wonder about the forms of studied indifference and the blindness towards black women's experiences that he and so many of his colleagues had when he produced so much of his creative work in mid-century. Because he's saying, yeah, I kind of recognize him, I didn't recognize him, I saw him, but I didn't see him. Okay? But however, his openness to the engagement of the work of Morrison, Walker, and Shange, and we remember the battles in the 1970s over Shange and Walker's work and the reaction to them. So the fact that James was so supportive of them really actually meant a lot to all three of them. And he had a particularly close relationship with Walker and Shange. They visited in London at that time. Shange actually dedicates her book of poetry, The Love Space Demands, to C.L.R. James and Romare Bearden, shortly after he died. And James's last critical essay that was published, three black women writers, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, and Ntozake Shange, celebrates their work not merely for its artistic merits, but also for the social movement that it embodies. And the context of this work is that James is at Brixton Library in 1980-81, and he's just holding forth and doing these readings of Shange's poetry. Exactly. So he's reading all of his poetry to audiences, and he's saying, well, at the point in which she uses the F word, I'm going to say that he made love to her. and various other kinds of things. But he's very engaged, and he is very interested in this work and what this work actually means. And the themes that he's finding particularly attractive are not just resistance to patriarchy and sexual commodification, and the ambivalent role of the Black church in Black community formation, but also the question of friendship between women, the question of women's happiness, the question of this new world that's waiting to be born. All of these are things that James is flagging as part of a new world that is coming into being and being made possible by these Black women writers from the United States. So this is a particular moment, an important moment in understanding James and gender. However, the most crucial moment, and certainly in many cases the most riveting moment, is his autobiographical reflections. And in an interview, the same interview that we quoted at the very beginning, James said the following about his autobiography. He says, "I know that an autobiography is the best way for me to sum up and to draw some conclusions. It isn't going to be purely what I've already said." And according to Anna Grimshaw, James never fully had his heart in the autobiography, but he labored away on it nevertheless, producing a number of striking but uneven and overlapping texts. But there's one part of it that James, by his own admission, devoted a very considerable amount of time to. And that's this essay titled "My Experiences with Women and Sex." And in a 1980 interview, he actually makes the significance of his chapter clarify. He clarifies the significance of his chapter. Not only did he write it early in the process of constructing the entire autobiography, but even though it was slated to come towards the end of the work, but he circulated it to a group of his friends for comments. In an answer about the significance of this chapter, because it seemed to be the only part of the autobiography that James was really interested in, he said, "Today, in my opinion, one of the great events in the world is that women are seeking to find out who and what they are. That, to me, is one of the great events that are taking place, and I want to say what I have to say to make a contribution to that clarification." So this is James in Trinidad in 1980 at 79, 80 years old, stating this. And so he suggests, on one level, in this comment, that women's liberation as a social movement is his primary interest. But then in the very next response that he gives, he actually reverses his perspective with a comment about his personal life. So he says the following: "There were some very satisfactory relations during those marriages," because James is married 3 times, "but they didn't work out completely as I wished. And now during the last 10 years, I've got to see that wherever they went wrong, the fault was mine." So the personal and the political are therefore being twinned by James. He says that he's going to deal with these both together. He's going to write this section of his autobiography called "My Experiences with Sex and Women," which is going to summarize, it's going to make a contribution, and it's going to also explain personally where he has been going wrong all of these years in his relationships with women. Now, My Experiences with Sex and Women is a 15-page amalgam of very intimate details about James's awareness of sex and relationships. And it's couched sometimes within some very deeply problematic formulations. Okay? At times, James, quite blithely, and without really much of a trace of criticism, describes relationships that he saw between men and women in colonial Trinidad that verge on sexual predation and assault. Okay? On the other hand, this revelation is coupled with some very striking observations about James's view of and vision for gender relations. And the most memorable parts of this article for the considerations that we'll follow come in James's discussion of his relationship with his second wife in the United States, that is Constance Webb, and deserve to be quoted in full. And this is very stream of consciousness kind of writing, okay? And it's a very long quote, but bear with me and do listen to this. Okay. After we had been married together for about a year, or perhaps 9 months, she told me one day with a certain passion, "Look here, tell me what you want from me, what you want me to do. What do you think of a wife you can like and what I can give to you? Tell me please, but don't leave me in this situation. Tell me something." I could tell her nothing, because I had only the vaguest idea of what she was speaking about. It seemed that as a husband, living in the same house, I was most unsatisfactory, not sexually, nor in my behavior. I am a well-behaved person. I don't quarrel or shout at people, far less shout at my wife. We go out periodically when there is something that we want to see. We have friends. There has always been enough money to carry on the affairs of a household, though at times things were rather sharp. But it seems that as a husband, my wife in Trinidad had spotted it, and my first wife in the United States was quite plain about it. My virtues as a husband were entirely negative, but I didn't pay attention to them as human beings sharing a life with me. I had a very active life, and dealing with politics and literature and matters of that kind, it was looked upon not so much by me, but for me it was quite natural, by everyone else as a kind of life which was unusual and was worth respect. These women gave it the respect that seemed such a life demanded, but I gave it all that I had in the way of attention and special concern. The plain fact of the matter is, as personalities, as individuals sharing a life with me, both in Trinidad and the United States, I ignored them completely. It was many years before I discovered that. Now, acknowledging this particular failure by James was not enough, because what he tries to do, like any good social and political theorist, is theorize the reasons for his shortcoming. Okay? And so he then goes and he talks about the relationships of women, talks about how his eyes have been opened to thinking differently about his relationships with women by the work of two Caribbean writers. One, the Guadeloupean Nobel Prize laureate, St. John Peirce, and George Lamming. And he cites particularly extensively from Lamming's Natives of My Person. I told you we'll get back to Natives of My Person. And there's some very interesting clarifications that need to be on order here about the relationship between James Lamming and Natives of My Person. Because a good couple of James's biographers, particularly Paul Bewley and Ken Rochester, have actually claimed that Lamming uses C.L.R. James and Selma James's relationship as a basis for talking about these wrenching difficulties of relationships between men and women in his novel Natives of My Person. Okay? Lamming completely denies this. Okay? He gets quite irritated when people say this. Okay? He's very clear that this is not true. This is one of the errors I've filtered into the historical record. He said so at conferences. He said so to me personally. However, so this is a misreading here. Okay? But the fabulous and interesting thing, oops, I'm not there yet. Why does it keep coming back? You're not quite there yet. Okay? So don't read that if it comes up again. The interesting thing here is that really it's something that both Selma and C.L.R. James themselves believed. Okay? So, and it inspires James to reflect further on the relationship that he had with women. So basically, the deal is this, and we'll quote James here. James says, I read the novel without seeing that it referred to me. But my wife, meaning Selma James, pointed it out to me. She said, there, George has meant you and me. So Selma is telling C.L.R., you know, Lamming is actually writing about the two of us in this novel. That's what he's doing. This is a template. Lamming is saying there's no way I had nothing to do with this whatsoever. But paradoxically, it's causing James to think more about his relationship with women. So with this passage by Lamming in mind, which Selma has pointed out to him referred to their relationship, James remarks the following. He says, I looked at it, and as usual, I didn't talk very much about it with her. But then I remembered what might happen to my first wife in Trinidad, and to the passionate protest of my second wife in the United States. What do you want from me? And that passage, written by Lamming, built the whole thing up in my mind and showed me that something was wrong, and I set myself to discover what it was. The fact remains, I would say, that I had a powerful prejudice against women as women, a prejudice to the extent that I cannot give myself completely and allow my affairs, etc., to tangle with their affairs and develop the relationship. I was absolutely unfitted for it. Thackeray, Dickens, Shakespeare, Aeschylus, they did not educate me on that matter. Although now that I read Shakespeare in particular, I can see many hints and references to the essence of a relation. But I didn't make it, they didn't make it clear as a French West Indian, St. John Peirce and Lamming made it. So James's confusion and despair are very evident in these paragraphs. The heart is truly a lonely hunter. But to play counterfactuals and speculate on what James might have done raises its own problems, as we know. Yet we can only wonder what James would have made of Bessie Head, dead 3 years before James in 1986, and a comment in A Question of Power, when Bessie Head says the following: "You know, men don't really discuss the deep metaphysical profundities with women. Oh, they talk about love, but their deepest feelings they reserve for other men." Our ponder of James's sources might have been somewhat different if he had written or revised this essay after his appreciation of the work of Morrison, Walker, and Shonke, because this essay is actually written before he reads their work. So James's journey is very much unfinished here, okay? But what is of greatest interest from my reading of this autobiography is his ready acknowledgement that his much vaunted colonial education and radical experience could not prepare him for the complexities of living a truly human existence with a woman. And this understanding is carried further in James's comment on black men's ability to form meaningful relationships with their wives. So he remembers this conversation, all of this in the unpublished autobiography chapter, in which this group of black women are saying, you know, black men seem to find it impossible to have a particular type of human relationship with their wives. And this is Sir's response to this. And finally, we're getting to that part that keeps popping up when it's not supposed to. "I cannot go along with them to say that it is black men who are unable to form this relationship with a wife. I cannot accept that. This matter has wider and deeper connotations than to say this by young black people. But I wouldn't be surprised if ultimately the black man, the slavery of 2 or 3 generations, and the situation he finds himself in a world in which things are opening up to him, finds it unable to accept the ideas of Western civilization and at the same time express himself fully and completely to the woman to whom he is married." So, black men cannot internalize the understandings of Western civilization and live a truly human existence with a woman. Is this merely the confessional writings of an old, tired man? Or alternatively, another explanation of a perpetuation of patriarchy by black men? Or, if we read James at his productive limit, is this Sylvia Wynter's The Colonization of Desire, coloniality's abduction in the intimate sphere, in what in Beyond the Boundary, if we go back to Beyond the Boundary, he referred to as our most intimate personal lives? We can practically hear James's sigh when he says, again in this quote, that the social attitudes we could to some degree alter if we wished, but for the inner self, the die was cast. But his writings on gender, full of inconsistencies, show that his radicalism will not accept this defeat. As an attempt to either reconcile his past self-admitted such shortcomings, or to tentatively propose a theory about the coloniality of gender relations in black communities, my experiences with women and sex is a failure. But it is an earnest failure. To use the words that James deploys to describe Toussaint Louverture, in him we see, and I quote, "passion not spent, but turned inward," end quote. The irony that James turned to St. John Peirce and George Lamming, 2 male Caribbean writers, and then to African American women writers to understand his relationships with women, should not escape us. Only towards the end of his life did James start to become aware that his intellectual journeys involve women at crucial stages. First, his very first short story that's published, La Divina Pastora, which is actually a story that he states was related by his grandmother to him, and then he took it and he fashioned and made it into a literary tale from there. Secondly, his mother's engendering of a love of the literary in him. Because so his father was a school teacher, James is very clear Beyond the Boundary that it's his mother who taught him a love for reading and a love for literature. But then also, thirdly, the very powerful Johnson Forest theoretical group in which he says he did his most creative work with in the mid-20th century, which composed, in terms of the leadership, 2 women, Raya Dunilevskaya, Grace Lee Boggs, and C.L.R. James. And then, of course, lastly, his very powerful intellectual interlocutors, intimate partners, and wives, namely Constance Webb and Selma James. But moreover, James's response to Caribbean women's writing was actually quite disappointing. He didn't think much of Merle Hodges' Crick Crap Monkey from 1970. Like many, he actually missed the signal importance of Paul Marshall's Brown Girls, Brown Stones from 1959, which for many people, they couldn't fit into a particular canon at that point in time. It's only more recently been rejuvenated and reassessed. I never seems to have encountered work like Simon Schwartz-Bart's The Bridge of Beyond. At the same time, the very year that the grand old man of Caribbean letters was rejoicing in the text of Shanghai, Walker, and Maren Morrison in Brixton, saw the publication of Erna Brodmer's acclaimed Jane and Louisa Would Soon Come Home, the papers of the Woman in the Caribbean Project, and in James's native Trinidad, the birth of a Concerned Woman for Progress group, which is for Trinidad's first avowedly feminist organization. A decade later, by 1990, and James of course passes in 1989, James would have had, if he had been alive, the texts of Brodmer, Kincaid, Brand, Edgell, Senior, Collins, Cliff, Goodison, Norbezi Phillip, Ramabai Espinet, Grace Nichols, just to give an example of the incredible outpouring of Caribbean women's writing that actually all occurs in that decade of the 1980s. So James was, almost a decade